The maid's voice cut through the hum of the conference room like a blade through silk. "Don't drink it," she whispered, eyes wide, breath trembling. "Trust me." If you're enjoying powerful silent revenge stories like this, subscribe to the channel Silent Revenge Story, share this video, and press the bell icon so you never miss a story that turns pain into justice. The coffee sat in front of me, steam curling upward, rich and dark, placed there with a polite smile by my daughter-in-law, Emily. The board members were still settling into their seats, shuffling papers, tapping tablets, clearing throats. The meeting hadn't officially started yet, but something already felt wrong. My fingers hovered near the cup, frozen between habit and instinct, while the maid, Lena, stood behind me, pretending to straighten a chair she had already aligned perfectly. Pain doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, carrying the weight of years. As I stared at that cup, memories pressed down on my chest, the slow realization that the family business I had built from nothing no longer felt like mine. I was the founder, the backbone, the one who had sacrificed nights, health, friendships. Yet lately I had become a ceremonial figure, wheeled out for meetings, introduced with respect but listened to with impatience. Emily had entered our lives 5 years ago, all charm and soft laughter. She married my son, Daniel, and quickly learned the language of boardrooms, contracts, and influence. I wanted to believe she respected me. I wanted to believe that the subtle sighs when I spoke, the way she interrupted me mid-sentence, were unintentional. But pain is a teacher that repeats lessons until you finally listen. That morning had already hurt before the coffee ever touched the table. As I arrived at headquarters, security had stopped me at the entrance, confused by my access card. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said, embarrassed. "Your clearance level seems to have changed, as if authority could quietly evaporate overnight. By the time it was sorted, I could feel eyes on me, curious, amused, judging. Inside the conference room, my seat was no longer at the head of the table. It had been shifted slightly to the side, just enough to be noticed, just enough to sting. No one explained. No one apologized. Emily simply gestured, smiling. "We thought this would be more efficient." Efficient. The word echoed like an insult dressed as logic. I sat down slowly, my joints aching, my pride aching more. Lena poured the coffee then, her hands steady, her face carefully blank. Emily thanked her without looking, already deep in conversation with a board member. That was when Lena leaned close, her whisper barely louder than my heartbeat. "Don't drink." My first reaction was annoyance. I had known Lena for years. She had been with our family longer than Emily. Loyal, quiet, invisible in the way people like her often are. What could she possibly know about boardroom games, about corporate politics? Yet pain sharpens perception, and in Lena's eyes I didn't see drama or imagination. I saw fear. I slid the cup slightly away, pretending to check my phone. My throat tightened. A strange realization crept in. I was no longer just being sidelined. I was being targeted. The meeting began, voices overlapping, charts flashing on the screen. Emily took control with ease, presenting figures I hadn't approved, decisions I hadn't seen. My name was mentioned only in the past tense. When the company was founded, in the early years. Each sentence erased me a little more. As they spoke, I felt the pain deepen, not just from betrayal but from loneliness. Daniel avoided my eyes. The board nodded along. Years of loyalty collapsed into polite indifference. I understood then that this wasn't a sudden coup. It was a slow, deliberate stripping away, done with smiles and coffee cups and rearranged chairs. The maid stood quietly by the wall, hands folded, watching me. She had risked everything to warn me, and I didn't even know why yet. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever was in that cup was only a symbol. The real poison had been brewing for a long time. And for the first time, instead of fighting back, instead of exposing the hurt, I chose silence. Not because I was weak, but because pain, when held long enough, hardens into something far more dangerous. Silence followed me like a shadow after that meeting, but humiliation waited openly, seated in the light. It arrived the very next week, carefully staged, impossible to deny. The boardroom incident might have been dismissed as a misunderstanding, but what came after was designed to be witnessed. The annual stakeholder luncheon was Emily's idea. She called it a celebration of legacy, and when she said the word legacy, she smiled at me as if offering a gift. The room was full. Investors, partners, journalists, faces I had known for decades. This was my world, or at least it used to be. I wore my best suit, the one I had worn when we signed our first international deal, believing foolishly that history still held weight. They seated me at a round table near the front, not center, not hidden either. Perfect placement for observation. As people mingled, I noticed something subtle but unmistakable. Conversations curved around me instead of toward me. A few polite greetings, quick handshakes, eyes already drifting elsewhere. I was present, but no longer essential. Emily took the stage with practiced confidence. She spoke of growth, innovation, the future. Slides flashed behind her, new leadership structures, new committees, new strategies. My name appeared once, small at the bottom of a slide labeled Foundational Period. Applause followed. I felt it like pressure against my ears, loud and distant at the same time. Then came the moment meant for me. "We're honored to have our founder with us today," Emily said, turning slightly in my direction. The spotlight shifted, literally. Heads turned, cameras lifted, and in recognition of his years of service, we've prepared something special. A server approached with a framed certificate. Not an award, not a role, not authority, just gratitude. A retirement-style thank you delivered while I was very much alive, very much present. Emily clapped first. The room followed. I stood because sitting would have looked worse. My hands accepted the frame, heavy and meaningless. The applause continued, long enough to be uncomfortable. I searched Daniel's face. He smiled, tight and uncertain, like a man watching a storm he hoped would pass quickly. "Would you like to say a few words?" Emily asked, already stepping back, already sure of the answer she wanted. Words rose to my throat, decades of them. Explanations, corrections, truth. But the room wasn't listening for truth. It was listening for compliance, for a graceful exit, for confirmation that the story they were being told was real. "I'm proud of what we built," I said finally. The microphone amplified the slight tremor in my voice, "and I trust it will be handled with care." That was all, polite, harmless, safe. As I sat down, the applause resumed, warmer now, relieved. The show had gone exactly as planned. I felt exposed, reduced, folded neatly into a narrative that left no space for resistance. This wasn't just about control anymore. It was about stripping dignity in public so that any future objection would look like bitterness. Pain sharpened into something colder. After the luncheon, journalists approached Emily, not me. Questions about vision, leadership, transition. I stood alone near the window, watching my reflection in the glass, older than I remembered, smaller somehow. That was when I noticed Lena again, moving quietly among the staff, collecting glasses. When our eyes met, she gave the smallest shake of her head, as if warning me without words. Later that evening, the final humiliation arrived, sealed in an email sent company-wide. "Effective immediately," it read. "All executive decisions will be handled by the new Leadership Council. Our founder will remain a valued advisor." Advisor, a title without teeth, without access, without power. The email went out at 6:03 p.m., just early enough for everyone to read it before dinner, just late enough that no one would reply. My phone buzzed with messages, sympathetic, awkward, some congratulatory. No one asked if this was what I wanted. I sat alone in my study, the certificate from the luncheon propped against the wall like a quiet insult. Outside, the house was still. Somewhere downstairs, I heard Lena moving, her steps careful, restrained. Public humiliation does something precise. It teaches you how small others want you to be. And once you understand that, truly understand it, you stop trying to prove your worth to the room. You start preparing for the moment when the room goes silent. Silence became my armor. After the email, after the luncheon, after the carefully choreographed erasure, I withdrew in a way that unsettled them more than any protest ever could. I stopped attending meetings. I stopped replying to long, rehearsed updates that explained decisions already made. I read everything, noted everything, and said nothing. They mistook my silence for surrender. From the outside, it probably looked that way. I spent more time at home, walking slowly through rooms filled with memories, blueprints framed on walls, awards tucked into shelves, photographs from groundbreakings and first deals. People assumed age had finally caught me, that the humiliation had broken something essential. Emily, especially, seemed relieved. She spoke freely now, no longer lowering her voice when I entered a room. But silence is not emptiness, it is space, and space allows truth to surface. Lena began leaving small things where I would notice them. A misplaced folder on my desk, a flash drive tucked into a book I hadn't opened in years, a comment delivered casually while pouring tea. They were up late again, she might say, or that meeting wasn't on the official calendar. I never asked her questions directly. We had developed an understanding built on years of quiet loyalty. She spoke when it mattered. I listened. The flash drive held minutes from private meetings, financial projections that didn't match what had been presented publicly, emails forwarded without commentary. Patterns emerged. Accounts shifted. Decisions rerouted through shell committees. Emily wasn't just taking control, she was consolidating it, rewriting structures I had put in place specifically to prevent exactly this kind of concentration. What hurt most was Daniel's involvement. Not active betrayal, but passive compliance. His signature appeared where mine used to be. His voice echoed Emily's language. He had convinced himself that this was progress, that pushing me aside was an unfortunate but necessary evolution. Silence taught me how people behave when they think they've already won. They grew careless. At home, dinners became quieter. Emily spoke about expansion plans openly, confident I either didn't understand or no longer cared. She never offered me coffee anymore. She didn't have to. The threat had passed as far as she knew. One evening, she laughed while recounting a tense call with an investor. They wanted reassurance, she said, smiling. They're still attached to the old face of the company. Old face. She glanced at me when she said it just for a second. I returned the look calmly, my expression unreadable. That unnerved her. I could see it. Silence reflects fear back to those who rely on noise. Meanwhile, I began visiting the office again, not the executive floor but the lower levels. Departments people forgot existed, compliance, internal audit, legacy systems. I had built personal relationships there long before Emily ever learned their names. I asked questions framed as nostalgia. Do you still do it this way? Is this policy still in effect? They answered honestly. Why wouldn't they? I was the harmless founder now, the ceremonial relic. Every answer filled in another gap. I learned that certain approvals had bypassed mandatory review, that internal warnings had been documented and quietly closed, that a pending acquisition had been rushed through with optimistic projections and minimal oversight. Not illegal, yet, but reckless, and recklessness leaves trails. At night I organized everything. Timelines, documents, decisions. I didn't plan revenge. Not yet. I planned clarity. Silence allowed me to see the whole board instead of reacting to individual moves. Lena watched me work sometimes, standing in the doorway. She never spoke, but once as she turned to leave, she said softly, "They think you're finished." I nodded, good. Because silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is a pause before a shift. A moment when everyone else leans forward, confident the story is over, unaware that the narrator has simply stopped speaking. And in that quiet, power begins to move, slowly, invisibly, back to where it was always meant to be. The shift didn't announce itself. Power never does when it's changing hands quietly. It moves through overlooked channels, old agreements, and people who were never invited to the table but were always watching it. I began with the bylaws. They were my fingerprints, written years ago when I had learned the hard way that trust needs structure. Emily had skimmed them. She understood headlines, not footnotes. Buried beneath layers of updates and cosmetic revisions were clauses that activated under specific conditions: risk exposure thresholds, governance imbalances, emergency oversight triggers. They weren't dramatic. They were practical, and they were still valid. All they needed was evidence. I requested a routine internal review under the pretense of legacy compliance. Nothing confrontational, nothing urgent, just a quiet audit. Framed as housekeeping for the company's upcoming anniversary. The request couldn't be refused without raising questions, and refusing me was something they had grown cautious about. Silence, I had learned, makes people second-guess themselves. The audit team was small, independent, and thorough. They found exactly what I knew they would because the trail had already been laid. Inflated projections presented as certainty, deferred risk disclosures, side agreements signed without full board consent. Again, nothing criminal in isolation. Together, they formed a picture no regulator would ignore. I still didn't speak publicly. I let the process speak for me. At the same time, investors began reaching out, not because I summoned them, but because uncertainty has a way of rippling outward. Emily's aggressive expansion had spooked the cautious ones. They wanted reassurance, stability, someone who understood the long game. I met them one by one, quiet lunches, private offices, no grand promises, just context. I explained why certain safeguards existed, why speed without discipline had nearly ruined us once before. I never criticized Emily directly. I didn't have to. Facts, when presented calmly, have a gravity of their own. Word spread, as it always does. The first visible crack appeared during a leadership council meeting I wasn't supposed to attend. I sat at the back, unannounced, as a courtesy role I was still technically entitled to. Emily faltered when she saw me, just for a moment. Enough. A council member asked about the audit. Another asked why certain numbers hadn't been shared earlier. Emily answered smoothly at first, then with sharper edges. Defensiveness crept in. So did doubt. Daniel looked between us, confused, caught in a current he didn't fully understand yet. The power shift wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No accusations. Just a growing awareness in the room that the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they had believed. Authority began to feel borrowed. That afternoon, the board chair called me privately. "We may need your guidance," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Temporarily." Temporarily was enough. Within days, an emergency governance review was invoked. Perfectly legal, perfectly procedural. Emily objected, of course. She framed it as sabotage, as resistance to change. But her objections sounded emotional against the calm weight of documentation. I watched her realize, piece by piece, that she was no longer controlling the narrative. At home, the atmosphere changed. She spoke less, listened more. Daniel asked questions now, real ones. He wanted to understand how things had escalated so quickly. I answered him honestly, without bitterness. Betrayal hurts most when it's unexamined. I wanted him to see clearly, even if it hurt. One evening, Emily confronted me in the study. "You planned this," she said, trying to sound certain. I met her gaze. I prepared for it. There's a difference. Planning implies malice. Preparation implies responsibility. She left without another word. By the end of the week, interim authority had been redistributed. Oversight committees reinstated. Decisions slowed. Investors relaxed. The company exhaled, like a body stepping back from the edge without realizing how close it had come. And me, I remained quiet, present, observant. Because power, once shifted, doesn't need to announce itself. It simply resumes its place, waiting for the final moment, when truth steps forward and shock follows close behind. The shock arrived not as an explosion, but as a revelation delivered in daylight, where no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. The emergency board session was scheduled for Monday morning. Emily believed it was procedural, a formality she could manage with confidence and polished slides. She arrived early, composed, carrying herself like someone who still thought the room belonged to her. When she saw me already seated at the table, this time at the head, her step slowed, just slightly, enough to notice. Lena served water, not coffee. The room filled quickly. Board members, legal counsel, external auditors. No press, no spectacle. The kind of meeting where outcomes are decided before voices are raised. Emily took her seat across from me. Daniel sat beside her, his jaw tight, eyes alert now in a way they hadn't been months ago. The board chair opened with formalities, then nodded to the lead auditor. What followed was precise, devastating, and impossible to dismiss. Timelines appeared on the screen, decisions accelerated without full disclosure. Financial models compared side by side, optimistic assumptions highlighted against internal risk assessments that had been quietly archived. Emails surfaced, not inflammatory, just damning in their ordinariness. Let's move this off record. We'll formalize later. The founder doesn't need to weigh in on this. Each line landed softly and cut deeply. Emily interrupted once, then twice. The third time the chair raised a hand. You'll have time to respond. Her confidence cracked not in anger but in confusion. She hadn't believed silence could gather witnesses. She hadn't understood that every shortcut leaves footprints. Then came the final document. A summary prepared by compliance, triggered automatically by the clauses I had written years ago. It outlined exposure, legal, financial, reputational, if current leadership structures remained unchanged. The recommendation was clear: temporary removal of executive authority pending full review. Temporary, the word returned, heavier this time. Emily looked at Daniel. He didn't look back. I did what I thought was best for the company, she said, voice steady but thin. We needed speed, vision. And accountability, the chair replied calmly, which requires process. The vote was swift, unanimous. Emily's authority was suspended effective immediately. The room went quiet, not awkwardly but completely. The kind of silence that follows a truth no one expected to hear out loud. Emily gathered her papers slowly, hands no longer steady. She stood, looked around the table, then finally at me. This isn't over, she said. No, I agreed, it's finished. She left without another word. The shock rippled outward over the next few hours. Investors were informed, legal teams mobilized. Internal memos went out clarifying interim leadership. Phones rang, messages poured in. Some supportive, some stunned, a few apologetic. Daniel came to see me that evening. I didn't know, he said, sitting across from me like a child again, stripped of titles and certainty. Or maybe I didn't want to. I told him the truth without cruelty. That power rarely looks dangerous when it's wrapped in ambition. That silence had been my only way to see clearly. That Lena's whisper had likely saved more than my dignity. She could have hurt you, he said quietly. Yes, I replied, and she hurt the company instead. At home, Emily packed her things. The house felt different without her presence filling every corner. Not empty, lighter. Lena moved quietly, efficiently, as she always had. When our eyes met in the hallway, I nodded once. Gratitude doesn't always need words. The revenge, if it could be called that, wasn't loud. There were no accusations shouted from rooftops, no public shamming. Just the sudden, undeniable reversal of control. The realization that the person who had been dismissed, humiliated, reduced to a symbol, had never actually left the game. Shock doesn't come from cruelty, it comes from precision. And as the company steadied itself, as structures returned to balance, one final truth settled in the minds of everyone involved. Silence had not been my weakness. It had been my weapon. Quietly, settles gently. and leaves behind a clarity that can't be argued with. In the weeks that followed, the company stabilized in ways numbers alone couldn't measure. Projects were paused, then restarted with care. Oversight returned not as punishment but as protection. Employees who had felt pressured to stay silent began speaking again, cautiously at first, then with confidence. The atmosphere shifted from urgency to intention. I declined the offer to reassume full control. That decision surprised many. Some saw it as humility, others as strategy. In truth, it was neither. It was understanding. Power, once reclaimed, doesn't need to be held tightly to prove it exists. I agreed to serve as interim steward, no title beyond what already carried weight. My role was simple: restore balance, then step back before imbalance could form again. Daniel changed the most. He listened now, not as an executive but as a son. We spoke long into evenings about responsibility, about how ambition can blur into entitlement if left unchecked. I didn't absolve him, but I didn't punish him either. Moral justice isn't about retribution. It's about learning without destroying. Emily never contested the decision publicly. Her legal counsel advised against it. The documents were too clear, the process too clean. She released a statement wishing the company well and moved on to other ventures. Some doors close loudly. Others close so firmly they never need to be mentioned again. Lena remained. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the study windows, I asked her why she had warned me that day. She paused, hands folded, choosing her words carefully. "Because I've seen this before," she said, "and because you listened when others didn't." That was justice too. Not the kind written into bylaws or enforced by boards, but the kind that recognizes loyalty without demanding spectacle. I ensured her position was protected, formalized, respected. Quiet people often hold the loudest truths. They deserve safety. The company marked its anniversary a few months later. This time the celebration was modest. No spotlights, no certificates, just acknowledgement of past, present, and responsibility to the future. I spoke briefly, not as a founder clinging to legacy, but as someone satisfied to see what had been built continue without corruption. I watched from the side of the room as new leaders spoke, measured, accountable, aware. The chair remained where it belonged, not as a symbol of dominance but of duty. Pain had taught me humility. Humiliation had taught me restraint. Silence had taught me clarity. Power had taught me responsibility. Shock had taught others caution. But moral justice taught me peace. Because justice isn't about winning. It's about restoring what was threatened. Dignity, balance, truth. When those return, revenge becomes unnecessary, almost childish. That morning, months later, I poured myself a cup of coffee at home. Lena stood nearby, arranging flowers. I lifted the cup, paused, then smiled at the memory of her whisper. "Trust me." I had, and in doing so, I had trusted myself enough to wait. Some poisons reveal themselves quickly. Others require patience, silence, and the courage to let people expose who they are. In the end, no one remembered the coffee. They remembered the lesson.